Well, thanks everybody. Great to see so many people here. So what I wanted to do is just kind of give a couple of examples and kind of talk about some best practices in the space, and then we wanted to open up the Q&A. So about half just to frame things, and then also about half of just general questions and things that will appeal to most people around the audience. So let me just start out with a quote to just kind of frame this. This was a quote from Bill Clinton as he was setting up the Clinton Global Initiative. And one of his fundamental premises was that most problems have already been solved someplace, somewhere. And the key issue was finding those solutions that were really world-class and scaling those solutions up. So I started working kind of in this space in 2005. And for me, I was very much like being in this room 6 years ago. I came into one of these SV2 meetings, and I really didn't know philanthropy very well. And I just kind of sat down in the corner. And I thought to myself, these people are all so smart. I couldn't really add any value, so I just decided to start volunteering on a very small scale. So one of the organizations I'll talk about today is Reading Partners, which at the time had a couple of employees. So I just decided that they were small, they'd never done a strategic plan, I would just help them with a strategic plan. So I mean, the hard thing about this field is that you can't buy a book that'll teach you everything. I mean, the great thing about this field is you can't find a book that'll teach you everything. So you just have to kind of get in there and learn it on the fly. So I think as I kind of think back, 6 years later, I think, the two big lessons that I learned are, number one, start small, because I kind of started with Reading Partners. It was very small. And that gave me enough experience to be able to help a much larger organization, which was New Teacher Center, which got me interested in the field and SV2, and just the whole field of venture philanthropy as a model. So for me, it's been kind of a journey. It's been a bit of a random walk. It's not been a straight line. But it's kind of moved to, I'm very interested in individual organizations and how they can achieve their maximum impact. And sometimes that's not growing your budget, but it's other levers. So we'll kind of talk about different levers for impact today. And then I think it's also in the case of, how do we bring more human capital into the system? Because, we in this room are really the biggest potential lever. It turns out if we get excited about something, we can make more time in our day. Right? So, I mean, that human capital is one thing that's actually expandable. It's not finite like financial capital. And then I think as we get more connected and more engaged, social capital becomes very, very powerful too. So we'll also kind of weave in these thoughts around human and social capital. So let me start then with just 4 big ideas. So a guy named Tom Tierney and Joel Fleischman. So Tom Tierney started an organization called Bridgespan, which does consulting. And Joel Fleischman was the head of a major philanthropy called Atlantic Philanthropies, which was extremely progressive. And they just published a book called Give Smart. And in that, they kind of identify 4 meta patterns that could really shift impact. And I think the first one is asking tough questions. So a lot of people have been, had coffee with me before, so they know the kind of questions that I ask. But I'll just skip forward to these. I mean, I think these are just samples, so there's no right or wrong here, but these are just ones that have worked for me in trying to peel the onion and understand what the key issues are. So I'm always starting with the vision. So, what is the vision of this organization? I mean, why did you do this? Okay, so where do we start? Where do we want to get to? And then, okay, that's the vision. And if you ever get to your vision, you're dead. So you don't actually ever want to get there. But, what is it? And then the next thing is, 5 years I think is too short, but tell me what it's going to look like in 10 years. I mean, that's about as far as anybody could really speculate with any kind of sense. But I think that will give you a sense whether you're talking to a nonprofit, whether you're talking to yourself and saying, how much more do I want to get involved with this organization or this lifestyle, talking to a collection of funders. What does this really look like in 10 years? So what is big success? And then I think the third is, what's the distinctive competencies? So what are you bringing? So if your organization was to go away, what would be the loss to the world? I mean, what do you do that no one else does? What's truly distinctive about what you do? And then this one is the engine. Okay, I mean, what do you love about this? I mean, so that's kind of your nuclear reactor, right? I mean, what is the most exciting thing about this to you? And how are you going to use that? And then, what do you fear? So these are the things that have to be addressed. Okay, I mean, is it succession planning? Is it fundraising? I mean, what are the key issues that are really keeping you up at night? Because those have to be addressed in the next 12 months. And then lastly, what are the top priorities for the organization in the near term? That's kind of the visible horizon of 1 to 2 years. And I really love to get the vision and the top priorities on a single sheet of paper and maybe even put them in a box at the head of every board agenda, because it kind of forces people to look at them because they have to look at what they're going to cover in the board agenda. So they kind of look at the vision and say, yeah, that still feels right. Or no, maybe we've evolved and we need to challenge that. So I think having the vision and the top priorities is just a focal point, but come up with your own list of questions. These are kind of the ones that I use, but these are simple questions, but they're extremely tough. And they force you to be very reflective and to think very deeply about what you're doing and why. So I think to me that's number one, is really kind of ask the tough questions of yourself. I mean, what are you doing? What are you doing here? Okay, and why? And then of your organization. And then if you're also thinking, and as we went around the room, a lot of people were talking about, you know, multi-blank initiatives, multi-funder initiatives, collaborations, etc. Okay, you know, what is the secret sauce that's going to come out of that? So ask those tough questions up front. Strategy is wonderful. I'm a big fan of, you know, having at least a 3-year plan and refreshing that plan every year, but execution is way more important, right? So that goes back to my point of, you know, always have your top priorities for the year up front. Always make sure when you do the annual reviews for the executive director that you've got no more than 4, hopefully 3 top priorities for the year, because when we try to focus on 10 things at once, we get nothing done. So it's really kind of really focusing on the execution part of it much more than strategy. And half the people, you know, we're talking about, you know, kind of capital as we went around the room in some form or another. So money is really critical. It's been relatively fixed for the past few years in philanthropy. There hasn't been, you know, yes, it's gone down a little bit, yes, it's gone up a little bit, but it's been relatively fixed since 2008. But going back to the human capital and the social capital, specifically the ability of people to influence other people if they're interested in an organization, these are the big leverage points as we sit through this kind of strained time in the economy. And then I think fewer, deeper, longer bets. And this was one of the key points in the book. And I know a number of people very well in the audience, and some of us were involved with, you know, 10 or 20 organizations, and we've cut back that number by a third or a half. So I think it's just the whole idea of placing fewer, deeper, and longer bets. So, and I kind of do that with the way I operate. I try to chair no more than 4 boards at once. Okay, that's my rule. I have a rule now, just so everybody knows.
Way to cut back.
And I try to sit on no more than 8 other advisory boards or boards. And then I try to consult with no more than 3 dozen other companies. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is, but it gives you an interesting perspective, because that means I'm understanding the models very deeply of about 50 different nonprofits in all different fields that deal with all different geographies. Some are very locally focused, some are regionally focused, some are nationally, some are internationally. But I think what you're seeing just in the philanthropic space in general is doing good work takes time, and so you have to be there for the long haul. And so the fewer, deeper, longer bets, I think, is a really important kind of meta pattern in the space. So now, as we went around the room again, we kind of heard people express, you know, a number of different things about, you know, building things out by kind of scaling the number of sites, how to increase leverage, what are your different leverage points. A good friend of mine who also sits on the New Teacher Center board is a gentleman named Roger King. He was a big consultant with Bain and ran their West Coast practice. Roger also works a lot in scaling, and for one of his organizations, he developed this simple chart as kind of a way to think about it. It's not right or wrong. This is not the gold standard by any means, but it's just one way to think about an organization that would like to start in a few sites and then scale, you know, linearly and grow. And that those organizations could go through a series of phases. So all of us either run organizations or have been on boards where it's early days, right? We've got the idea, we're passionate about the idea, we're putting it to practice in its first site. That's what we're calling here kind of the pilot phase. And the primary vehicle that we're using there is, it's a research project. Okay? We like the idea, we're going to try if it works. The key capability is really the program design. Okay? It's not going to necessarily be as good as it could ever be in the future, but we're going to put most of our key competence into the program design. We're going to have total control over that site or maybe the second site, and we're going to run that for some period of time, generally kind of 2 to 3 years, to see if the pilot proves out. Okay, so I think most of us in this room, we've kind of been through that phase. Then as you move to this, and if you have a model that's more about kind of linear replication, okay, I start in 1 site, I go to 2 sites, 4 sites, which will be one of the examples that I'll use next, which is Reading Partners, where it started in 1 site and now it's moving to, you know, 100+ sites. That's kind of a direct service model, right? You're providing a direct service, you're copying it, wholly owned subsidiary kind of if you're in the business. And the key thing here is you're going from a few sites to lots of sites is management, because it's hard, right? It's really hard. So the financial part is hard, the program part is hard, and the human capital part are all hard. And very few organizations actually make this transition where they get to hundreds of sites. It's very difficult to do, and most of them take closer to 10 years relative to 5 years. But as you start to look at this, you start to, once you talk to people, they finally one day, they look at this model and they say, okay, I raised $500,000, now I have to raise $1 million. I raised $1 million, now I got to raise $2 million. And all of a sudden they start to do the math. And the math is, if your vision is, for example, in education, most organizations have a vision of one day all kids. So no matter what they do, it's like one day I want to reach kind of all the kids. And if you kind of step back and say, okay, one day I want to reach all the kids in the US. And the next example I want to use briefly is Reading Partners, which does one-on-one literacy tutoring using volunteers in elementary schools. So if you start to think about that, how many elementary schools are in the US? 66,000. Okay? So 66,000 times, how much does it cost to run that program at any one school? Okay, 75,000. Okay, so who's good at math? 66,000 times 75,000?
That's 500 million.
Actually, it's about almost 5 billion.
Sorry about the zero.
Yeah, it's like 5 times 10 to the 9th. So if you start to do that and say, okay, it's 5 billion, all the philanthropy in the U.S. is 300 billion. Okay, if you take away, faith-based giving, okay, then it's less than 200 billion. So that means that 2.5 cents of every dollar is going to go to one nonprofit? No, it's not going to happen, right? So if you're going to stay true to your vision of one day all kids, then you're going to need to start to think about what are other levers beyond direct service. So if you start to look at organizations that have kind of scaled in that kind of fashion, whether it's Teach for America or City Year or things like that, they eventually get to a point here where they start to think about broad adoption, right? And that's kind of where you switch from a direct service model to more of a franchise-based model where you're doing training and technical assistance. So that then becomes the key gating item. And there's a Bay Area nonprofit right now that's actually making this transition. Very few nonprofits actually make this transition at scale. It's this organization called Playworks, which manages recess, okay, in elementary and middle schools, and it's scaled to about 300 direct sites. And it, for the last 3 or 4 years, has piloted this kind of, franchise training and teaching assistance model, and is just now going into what I would call big selling mode, and already has several hundred of these sites up and running in the broad adoption category. So very difficult to do, but you see what's happening here, right? You're going from a direct service model where there's a high reliance on philanthropy to a consulting model where you're basically getting paid for your time. It's cost plus. So it really doesn't require philanthropy if done well. And the key skill is now not management, the key skill is sales. So if you go to Playworks, what you'll see is they actually have commissioned sales staff. And they have commissioned sales staff that are, some of them whom are making as much as the executive director because they're selling a lot of program. And now it's about setting standards. So even before we started, I was talking to a few people while we were getting lunch, and a lot of people were thinking about, okay, when would I think about some kind of transition like this? And my experience firsthand has been, it's good to do it after you've really kind of proven this out to an extent, that you've really kind of got independent third-party validation that your model really works before you do this. So I've had experience of doing it too early, and I'm seeing the effects now of waiting until you've actually had randomized controlled trial data and things like that, that you can actually do that. And then that allows you to get to thousands of sites, but still, if there's Playworks example, 66,000 elementary schools, and they got to 6,000, which is their goal 5 years from now, that's still only 10%, right? And that's huge. I mean, that's just a phenomenal home run, 10% penetration of a problem on a national scale, but it doesn't get all the way there. And remember, these walls are porous, and a lot of organizations exist as they get bigger at multiple of these levels. But then you'll see the lever of policy and advocacy. You'll see communications then being the key driver of that. Broad influence is how can I affect other sites which actually don't fall under my model, but do the same thing. Right? So how can I generally shift policy? And so as you can see, the time to impact, if it's 3 years to run through a pilot and 10 years to run through kind of the flagship phase where you have 100+ sites, and then another 10 years to run through this, I mean, you're already out at 25 years and you're getting broadly applicable in policy, right? So it doesn't mean they have to be linear. The walls between these are porous. We'll talk about a little bit about New Teacher Center as one example, which does direct service, which does training and TA, which does policy and advocacy, so they can all exist under one tent. And that was, for those of you who've read a really good book called Forces for Good, which came out about 5 years ago, it really talks about that and picks some number of nonprofits and kind of talks about these various phases and how the best nonprofits, when the book was written, okay, actually had programs in multiple areas of this. So this is neither good nor bad. It's just a way to think about scale.
Would you say that probably the most important component of that is control, and that the only way that you can scale is if you are keeping some kind of semblance of control, particularly with quality?
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about here in this.
Yeah, I mean, having tight control over hundreds of sites. Anybody here got tight control at all? I mean, it's hard to just even have it over 5 sites, much less hundreds. And that's why.
Well, that's why it's so hard to do. I mean, that's why it's really very hard to do.
Was that an overestimation, perhaps, to say you're going to have tight control over 100?
Well, no, because I mean they're all wholly owned. They all fall under one 501c3, as opposed to once you start doing training. Okay, you're doing training for other organizations, right? So you don't, the level of control that you have is greatly reduced. So it's just like if it was McDonald's, right? It's just like company-owned stores versus franchise stores. I mean, you still have the book and you still have the code because that model was proved out and people want to retain their franchises. But not only do you have to set standards, but you have to enforce the standards. So if people aren't living above the bar, they have to go.
The question?
Sure.
Maybe you'll get to this. I'm thinking about what would be, as you go through pilot flagship and so on, what would be the necessary progress in the structure and the population of the boards of directors?
Great question. So I mean, normally, so everybody in this room has lived this, right? So this is the Friends and Family Board. This is the board that meets once a month. This is the board that like wears hats as far as operations because there's not enough staff, right? So it's a classic operating initial board. Somewhere in here, you know, once the budget starts to reach a couple $1 million, you need to begin that transition. So it always depends on, you know, how strong the founder is and all of these other issues. But at somewhere you have to have that operating to governance kind of board transition. Okay. Generally, I would say it's, you know, in the $1 to $5 million range, depending on how much of a fundraiser the founder, you know, executive director is. And then, you know, once you kind of cross the, you know, the $5 million range, $5 to $10 million range, then other things become really important, right? So and also, and I'll get to that in my next example, it'll depend on a number of key factors. Okay, what percentage of your revenue is philanthropy, right? So like what kind of reach do you have to what kind of customers, right? So most of the organizations, you know, once they get to a certain size, they're either going very deep locally, so they're kind of totally solving the need, or they're trying to be regional or national. So it's the operation to governing board transition, and then it'll be kind of the connectedness of the board members after that, depending on what geography you're servicing. Okay, so if you want to be a major national organization, so there's a organization called Year Up. Have anybody heard about that? Okay, so you know it's kind of the poster child in the nonprofit space. I mean, it's about 10 years old and it's grown extraordinarily rapidly. It's about $50 million this year. You know, dealing with 18 to 24-year-old kids who normally can't graduate from high school and can't get a job, and basically giving them 6 months of training and 6 months of internship. So Year Up had the founding board chair for 10 years, a guy named Tim Dibble, who ran an investment fund, you know, very well respected in Boston. They got to be a $20 million organization. The entire board was comprised of people from Boston. And now they were in like 5 or 6 other major cities around the US. So it came to a point where they needed to then kind of move some of the leadership of the board to a national scale, and that kind of national gravitas that could get them a meeting with the head of Google, or could get them the meeting with the head of Target, or things like that. So there are kind of those natural evolutions as you get to scale, but the first one is obviously operating to governing, which most of us in the room have experienced, or wish we have experienced, because we haven't quite got there yet. Okay, so then just, again, a big overview, and then 2 organizations I've been deeply involved with. I wanted to use them just as examples. They're neither right nor wrong. They're just examples that we can talk about a lot of different aspects of this around to tee questions off of. So first one I want to talk about is an organization called Reading Partners, and before we get into a lot of numbers here, again, the model is very, very simple. Okay, you or I want to help our community. So we volunteer to be a tutor one-on-one. So we meet with our child. We own that child for a year, that school year. And we meet with them twice a week, and we do 45 minutes of one-on-one using a curriculum specifically designed to be used by volunteers. And what we see is for each 20 hours we spend with that child, he catches up one grade level. Right? So that's kind of the program. It's, it's high touch. It's very high reward because you're interacting with one child and you're actually feeling and seeing the progress that that child's making. So this organization was given an SV2 grant in the 2004-2005 school year. At the time, it was in a couple of sites serving about 100 kids, very, very local. And so this was kind of a classic linear scaling model. This was a program that worked in a few sites and then wanted to scale. So I gave you a few snapshots here over periods of time. So this is 2004-2005 school year, 4 years later, 2008-2009, and then 3 years later is the current year and the current school year. So the whole idea was this was a program that worked, and we felt it should be everywhere. So the question was, how could we go about scaling it, and what did that really mean? So as you can see now, it's kind of grown from 100 kids to 2,900 kids this year with the goal of about 8,000 kids. And I think the drivers have been twofold. So the growth so far has been driven very, very much what I would call push. Okay, we thought we had a good idea, and we were pushing it onto schools, right? The marketplace has flipped in about the last 4 or 5 months. So many of you may be aware that there's a kind of a ground swelling up from lots of cities around the U.S. around collective impact. How can we work together collectively? And there's been big movements in education. And so what's happened here is there's been a poll by many cities around the U.S. which have already identified a problem in education, which is 4th grade literacy. They've already gotten all the major funders around the table to say we're going to redirect our money to key inflection points in the education problem, one of which is 4th grade literacy. So there's already a critical mass, and now the organization is kind of being pulled instead of having to push, which is also a very important problem in growth, right? Because it's very easy to overstep. So this just kind of gives you a sense. So those are kind of the key numbers, but we look at the metric of how many kids are we accelerating reading, how many hours of tutoring for each grade level caught up, and then the cost metric. How can we make the program more effective with cost while keeping the program evaluation number equal or better than it was at a smaller scale. The next huge question in all of this is, how deep are you going to go? So there's a lot of nonprofits that say, okay, I want to be a national nonprofit, and they open up one program in the Bay Area, and then they kind of run off to the next place and open up a program in LA, and they run off to the next place, and they never go very deep in any part of their community. So at Reading Partners, from a board strategy decision, we decided, okay, we're willing to run around the country if we're going to commit that every region we go into, we're going to eventually try to serve a minimum of 10% of the total community need. So that's 10% of the kids who read, 1 or more years below grade level in 3rd grade. So that really then, of course, changes everything, right? Because that means you're there for the duration. You've got to go really deep. You've got to build a really deep, sustaining network. One of the toughest things about growth from a financial standpoint is that as your budget gets bigger, you actually need to accrete more reserve capital. So, best standards in the nonprofit space is to have 3 to 6 months of cash. That's not easy to do. But what you have to do then in order to be able to do that is you've got to actually be able to get unrestricted dollars so that you actually can run a net operating income, so you have excess capital at the end of the year, which isn't allocated, to program, that actually could be accreted to cash reserves, right, or working capital, same thing. So it's extremely difficult to do, and I think you have to really look to a board to network for that, because the simplest way to get unrestricted capital is from individual donors, and you're having that be from your board and from board-led. So this was kind of a key support driver, at least in the Reading Partners story up until the current point in time. As the numbers start to get bigger, it takes even more planning to be able to accrete, because the numbers get a lot larger. And then I think the single most important point, and kind of where I start in looking at any nonprofit, is what is the funding model? So I've got kind of different things here which are a little bit cut off, but what this says is what percentage of your revenue is from philanthropy? And like all, nonprofits, when they start out, we're a nonprofit for a reason, right? And we want to help people, and we don't want price to be an issue, so we underprice our product, right? Because there's no value, right? Give it away, right? So it starts out at 100%. And then as you realize, gee, this really works, how can we help kids? You start to think about, okay, what are my other levers for revenue? And in this case, we started to think of a couple. Number one is, if it's really good and all of a sudden we're not calling principals to get into schools, principals are calling us to have us come to the school, we should start charging something, right? So you can start charging. So it's fee for service. And it's how do you build that up? How do you fair price it? And then how do you, transition customers that weren't paying anything to paying something? So that was something, as you can see, if you look kind of at this model, it says, we're at about 12% now, but that we still got a legacy of a whole bunch of people who don't pay. Right, so actually the new customers coming on today pay between 33, 1/3 and 1/2 of the total cost. And so that's something we've been able to transition to. So I do think, 3 or 4 years from now, it'll probably be, 25 to 35%. The other thing that we've done, anytime you use volunteers, has been able to leverage the government. So the federal government AmeriCorps program, which now carries its own risks, because who knows when AmeriCorps funding is going to stop. So that's something that you need to consider in this. But in this case, in every school that this program is in, somebody has to run the school site. And if you train them well, it can be an AmeriCorps volunteer. And what ends up happening with AmeriCorps is the government, matches some of their salary. Right? So you have that as revenue to your system. So for every site this program is in right now, 61 sites, we have 61 AmeriCorps volunteers working as site managers for each one of those sites. So that ends up providing some of the revenue. And then I'm always a big fan of looking at what already exists. I mean, it's great to do policy and advocacy for about 10 or 20 years out, but what already exists? So in the case of reading in the state of California, we passed, I think 5 or 6 years ago now, Proposition 49, which was called After School Education and Safety. And what it said is that if you run, an after-school program and you meet these certain criteria of tutoring and et cetera, you could qualify for this funding stream. And so because it's a proposition, it's set aside and cannot be cut, right? So it's kind of a $550 million pot, okay, that's freely accessible and, not subject to the legislature. So as we began to design programs, we kind of took the current program that we had, added the few supplemental requirements that were required to meet this proposition funding, and then could open new sites that were cash flow positive, which means that the income from ACES would fully pay the cost plus some. So then that's a California-only phenomenon today, which will allow us to go very deep in California, and we feel it'll become part of that blended revenue. And then there's other things. So all of these started as little pilot experiments in the background. Did it work if you put AmeriCorps volunteers in the classroom? Did you get the same results as if you had a retired teacher? Right, so you did all those experiments. The answer was yes. So then you phased that in over time. The fee for service, you developed a backlog of customers. You started approaching them at higher levels, price points, and you implemented that in slowly over time. And we continue to look on a state-by-state basis and city-by-city basis for pockets of money that could allow organizations to go very deep. So there's pockets of money that exist in metro regions like in DC and Newark and other cities that have set up those kinds of things. But it's just a way to think about the funding model and how can you expand, because we did the math before, right? This organization is not going to get $5 billion a year in philanthropy. And it probably won't reach every kid, but if it wants to reach 1 in 10 kids, it has to get very creative about how it could evolve its revenue model. So that's just an example of what I would say is an organization that's 7 or 8 years into scaling, that has a classic scaling model of scaling the number of sites and moving its footprint over the US. And those are kind of the classic issues that any organization of that ilk would face. And it's also now piloting in the background, going back to kind of what I talked about with Playworks, doing training and technical assistance to potentially see if they could come up with a robust franchise plan that they could prove out on small scale.
Lance?
Yeah.
You talked about all of these things are going into your funding and increasing your funding, but you're also showing some significant drops in cost per student. And how, in the high touch, which a lot of the organizations
right.
we deal with, how do you
Well, it's a little bit of scale, right? So what you're seeing here is, you're seeing it go up, and then you're seeing it go down. So there's a one-time phenomenon that's happening here, which is you're getting a whole bunch of capacity building grants. They just want a social innovation fund grant. So you're getting a whole bunch of money coming into the system to build national level capacity. And then as you start to amortize that, okay, then you start to get cost savings because now you can use that capacity over an increasing number of schools. So you're putting in senior level people that have bandwidth to be able to expand the organization 3- to 5-fold. So you have a very low cost for the site director. So I mean, what you're seeing here basically here is the efficiencies that come in. And then as we have those efficiencies, we actually can have more kids per school. Right, so we can kind of go from 100 to 125 by how we support the overall program. But I think it's just a really important metric, just always being able to ask ourselves, what are all the levers, right, and how would we play with those? Phil?
So there's a lot of creativity in some of this. Just identifying some of the levers and identifying the way you go broad versus speed. Where did you get the information you needed for these creative ideas? I mean, were they generated by the board? Did you use outside consultants? Did you talk with large foundations? Where do people go to get that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd recommend any organization to figure out, who is your peer group? I mean, who do you aspire to be like in whatever space you're in? So, I mean, with Reading Partners, that's what we did. We kind of stepped back and said, okay, we want to be a national organization that, it's going to scale its number of sites. So who is our peer group? So, we picked a few organizations that were much farther along than us, like Jumpstart and Teach for America. And we learned everything we could about them. We made friends with the people in those organizations. We got their business plans that went back to when they were our stage. Okay, and we did all kinds of modeling, and then we had people that we could talk to. And when you look at those, I mean, AmeriCorps is a tool that's used by, most of those national nonprofits. So, I mean, that was a fairly obvious one. We just had to make sure that we wouldn't sacrifice quality, for lower expenses, right? So that was one that we tested. I think fee-for-service was a relatively obvious one, and we were talking about it as a board because, I mean, it's just one of the things that you can think about in terms of who can pay when an actual customer came to us with a check. And that was really kind of the tipping point. I mean, we were talking about wanting to do it, but it was a principal who had been a principal at a school where we had the program. Now she'd moved to another school. She knew how much it worked. She said, I have money, right? Title I dollars that are, my responsibility and my discretion. I'll use those monies. And I think as you get here, you start to get more creative, but it's starting to put the policy hat on. So in retrospect, it looks complicated. I think the key thing goes back to the questions. I mean, I'll just go back to the vision. I mean, if your vision is kind of one day all kids, okay, and you're stuck here, you can't get there. Okay, it could be one day all kids in a geography like East Palo Alto, and that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But then, is this going to even solve it for that? So I think it's really kind of working backwards from the vision and saying, what are the structural barriers that I need to get there? Who is my peer group that I aspire to be like? And what do I know about how they, went over the challenges that I have to go over? Kelly?
Yeah, I think it's clear we've done a great job sort of illustrating the growth in funding. But in addition to the growth in funding, because it's such a direct touch model, you obviously have a lot of growth in volunteers.
Right.
So how did you actually scale that aspect, especially when you go so deep in one particular area?
Yeah. So when I first got involved in the organization here, we thought that volunteer recruiting was limiting. So that was the hypothesis, right? So we couldn't, that was going to be the limits to scales, that we couldn't recruit enough volunteers. And then as the organization got big enough, we hired somebody. So I mean, just kind of using print ads, radio ads, direct marketing to corporations. I mean, volunteer recruitment is actually a non-issue. So we have actually not had any issue. So we've gone from the old model, whereas if you wanted to volunteer, you had to sign up for your child and you had to come twice a week. Okay, to maybe having you and I tag team one child, right? So that it's only half the amount of time. And then that's as far as we've gone so far, and then we're still kind of looking at could you have 3 or 4 as part of a corporate thing, but that has not been a limitation by those 3 levers of outreach. And also the retention's been good because I think it's a pretty high quality experience because it's so direct, right? And the results can be so dramatic. that hasn't been an issue. Okay, so I wanted to show this one just because it's kind of, it's a linear scaling so far where, this is still what I would call that flagship phase, going back to the last slide. So it's still trying to prove out its flagship. Just now beginning to really, pilot again what a training and technical assistance franchise-like model could look like. But, pretty much, targeting like 150 to 200 sites with running kind of the training and TA pilot in the background.
Lance, can you talk a little bit about how the management team has changed, shifted over time? When you think about the skills that are required to be successful and how that changes.
Yeah, great question. So, started with the founders, right, who were, running it themselves, right, just kind of from their kitchen table. The first executive director was hired, a couple years before this, but basically it's, one person who had been a former TFA person, but was still relatively young. And then, right about here, we brought in Michael Lombardo, who's the CEO now, who was like 26 at the time, but, had a good track record, and we knew that we were taking a risk. And that's gone really well. Michael brought in his number 2, and I think it's the role of the board always to, evaluate the executive director, right? And it's also the role of the board just to understand the organizational strength that's there. So in terms of, looking at Michael's reviews, at me as the board chair, kind of asking him, what's your assessment in terms of how far do you think this person can go? Because we all know this, right? We know this about ourselves. We know this about people we work with. They may not have the capacities to do that same job if the organization is 10 times bigger or if the organization is 100 times bigger, right? So we continue to kind of push on all those levers, but that core team of CEO and COO is still there and still outperforming, as well as a couple people who were early on, who were initial site directors, who are leading program work. Now we've brought in all kinds of other people, like CFO and chief program officer, chief development officer, and things like that. But I think the core team still looks strong, has grown. I don't see any limits right now, although we are very looking at that.
So when determining how many more schools to go in and looking at that increase, I know you said you looked at a couple of other nonprofits,
Right.
And you looked at financially.
Right.
Anything else in particular that you looked at, in particular with the growing of the number of schools that you're in?
Yeah, so we have a whole metric in terms of percentage of free and reduced lunch. In terms of we're targeting very high need schools, right? That's it, and we've kind of targeted areas initially that have good philanthropy. So we started in the Bay Area, we went to LA, went to Sacramento, DC, New York, and now we're looking at a whole host of other cities. But it's really, number one, is driven by the need, right? So we're going to high poverty neighborhoods where there's a safe commuting corridor, because we can't get good volunteers in and out if they have to drive 3 miles through some place that's not physically safe if they have to get stopped at a red light. So there are some issues, but otherwise we're really trying to serve those high need areas. And we're looking at philanthropic capacity of those areas. But I think what people have learned in the scaling space is that, and I think Teach for America has shown well, is they say, well, you can't raise philanthropy in New Orleans. Well, New Orleans is like their most profitable site in the United States. So all these places that people would say are second-tier markets, that's nonsense if you have a good cause and you have a good team that's actually working with. So whether it's Omaha, Nebraska, or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or all of those cities has enormously thriving nonprofits that have scaled there with the right leadership. So I wanted to move to the next slide. But so this is kind of, I meant to have this one just kind of as a linear example, and then I want to move to the New Teacher Center example, which is a bit more complicated. So New Teacher Center has been doing what they're doing a little bit longer, but let's just talk about the model first. So what did they do? So what the New Teacher Center does is focus on first and second year teachers. And any of you who've been in the audience have been a first and second year teacher, you probably didn't get a mentor. And if you got a mentor, you got to assign somebody as kind of a buddy who was doing it on the side and may or may not have done anything at all for you. So the whole idea is could you go into a school district and could you work with the school district to get the best teachers released to you, your organization, so that you could train them to be full-time mentors. And they could have, a dozen or so teachers that they mentored. So that means they could spend hours every week with each teacher They could meet with them as a cohort and talk about shared learnings. And that was really the model, so that you would go into a school district, you would work with a superintendent and his team, you would get a number of master teachers released to you to be mentors, you'd train those people, and they would work one-on-one with the new teachers in the district, okay, as well as the principals of that district, to really kind of coach them. So it was really what we call a train the trainers model, because if you look at the New Teacher Center 990, it says like it has a $20 million budget. But 90% of the costs of the program don't hit the 990 because the school district releases to you their master teachers and they pay for them. So the real program budget is not, $20 million. It's like $200 million because it's 10x. So, it's a big program. And so the model, works because when you actually mentor teachers, they actually stay on the job and student achievement goes up. Right, so it's kind of a double plus for a school district. They don't have the turnover and retention losses, and they get student achievement gains. So that's the direct part of the model. And the key lever for this, so in many ways, NTC never did flagship. It actually kind of moved to a training and technical assistance model on day one, because what ended up happening with Ellen is she was able to run a pilot project in Santa Cruz County, which lasted almost 10 years. And the outcomes of that pilot project is that if you mentor these teachers, okay, they stay longer, and student achievement is better. So therefore, you had this kind of randomized control trial on day one, and when you started to talk to superintendents, they would say, oh, I've got to give you, 10 of my teachers full-time and pay for them, not in the classroom, just to mentor 100 new teachers. And they would look at the data, and they would run the numbers, and they would say, okay, that makes sense to me, I'll do it. And that's only because you've done this massive pilot, right, which was very big and very long. So as we look at this, we say, okay, this will get into levers for impact, right? So we've got kind of the direct short-term strategy. So the direct short-term strategies is to mentor new teachers in the classroom, to train the principals in those schools, right, about learning conditions and working conditions and what the issues of the teacher are to increase student achievement. So these are kind of the two, direct gears. And as part of working with the teachers and working with the principals, you start to set new norms and values and habits. So this is what you can see on a rolling annual basis as kind of your outcomes. Once an organization then begins to look at, okay, I can, one day all new teachers, okay, we're kind of working that model, okay, one day all new teachers. We're up to about 7%. We're going to argue about percentages, but we're up to about 7% of all the new teachers in the United States, and we're not even looking at rural ones because they're hard to get to. We're just kind of focusing on large urban school districts, high poverty. So we're well over 10% of all the new teachers in that target market in the United States. And then we're kind of asking the questions, okay, what are the other kind of systemic longer-term factors? Okay, so we'll go back to the diagram we had before, kind of what's the policy and advocacy, and what's kind of the data. So New Teacher Center a number of years ago decided to start surveying at the district and the state level about teacher working conditions, because the primary change agent in the school is the teacher, okay, and the number one criteria of how well they're going to do are the working conditions in which they operate. So comprehensive assessment surveys, and they've been doing them now state by state, and are up to 20 plus states in the U.S. where almost every teacher enters their data about the working conditions, and those can be sorted, okay, by state, by subject, by by school, by district. So it's a very, very powerful data set that's now begun to influence policy. So this became kind of a research and policy arm of this. So it's back to kind of that policy advocacy research lever, which is now kind of systemic and long-term. And, this is, 5 years ago in an organization that's, now a little over 10 years old, but then its pilot goes back another 10 years. So it's, it's like 15 years into the game that this became a key research lever that you could start to play with. And now that this has been running for 5 years and started in North Carolina, is now in almost 20 states, becomes a huge data resource that you can then use in terms of kind of the policy and advocacy you can do on both a state level and a federal level. But if you go back to that kind of model that I had before, it's really kind of a training model where you work with the district to be a trainer for the district. Okay, and then you start to leverage policy and advocacy for systemic long-term pieces. And I think, you know, it's not a simple story, and that's why I love like 4 gears. Because I mean, to me, it's like, can you get it on one sheet of paper? Because if you can't get it on one sheet of paper, the board's not going to understand it, which means investors aren't going to understand it. I mean, no one's going to understand it. And can you make it as simple as possible to show that they really all have to work together? I mean, if any one of these, okay, generates excess energy, excess value, like this or this, it pulls everything else along with it. Right? So that was the whole idea of kind of having the gears interactive with that. So that's a lot of talking and stuff here. So I wanted to use this as an example of an organization that's thinking about kind of using all of those different types of levers, right? So I mean, it ran its pilot. It does some direct service in schools where the city just brings it in. It just pays it to run the whole thing, like Chicago Public Schools or in Ravenswood here in EPA. But most of it is under a training and technical assistance model that involves research policy and advocacy components too. So it's kind of a hybrid. And I think that's what you see if you go back to books like Forces for Good and you look at organizations that have been around, you know, at least 10 years and in most cases like 15 or so years, as they start to look at multiple levers for impact, but that, you know, it's really impingent on the board to always come back and say, what's the right level of investment in each one of these, right? Because, you know, times change and you shouldn't just be doing it exactly the same way. You should be utilizing these kind of in creative ways based on the times.
Great, so everybody, we've got about 25 minutes left, so we'll just get through as many questions as we possibly can. Anybody have a burning one?
Well, another way to scale is to combine, at
Yeah.
least in the business world.
Yeah.
And certainly there are a lot of organizations around the country serving similar missions. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think combinations are great. I mean, they're hard in the for-profit sector and not for the same reason, which is, you know, ego. But I mean, I think just so that all folks are aware, there is a trend for that. There's a lot of foundations that will pay for it. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to make the story complicated, but Reading Partners has adopted a acquisition strategy as one of its growth legs. Because in that space of after-school education and safety, which was that revenue bucket that they could access on the state level, there are a lot of small operations that really aren't being run very effectively. So they actually can go in and go much deeper. We just did a merger with an organization in the Mission District of San Francisco. So I think number one, I think they can make a lot of sense. There has to be a good driver for them, so it's just not two financially struggling organizations merging, hoping for the best. And I think if you can figure out how to handle, you know, if that all makes sense, then it's, you know, the human part of it, right? I mean, the ego part of it. But no, it makes sense. And so, I mean, locally, the Grow Foundation is looking to, you know, sponsor merger-based activity. Nationally, there's an organization called Sea Change Capital Partners, which Reading Partners got like a $75,000 grant from. All these organizations want to pay for all the stuff that you can't, you know, get anybody to pay for, like getting audited financials for your merger partner back to, you know, the beginning. So there's a lot of interest in the space. There's a lot of consultant work in the space that you could, you know, lots of people you could talk to, lots of examples out there. I mean, Bridgespan, there's a number of case studies out there that are good.
Usually, an organization that was mentioned started out regionally, then it went statewide,
Right.
Nationally, and they're expanding. But you know, I'm a former principal, and
Right.
talking to all my colleagues, the program seems to be losing quality as it's getting bigger. And I'm wondering, at what point, I mean, what internal assessment do you use to measure your quality, not just because we have more money, we have more sites, but we're actually keeping the quality within your growth model.
Yeah, exactly.
Without using it.
Exactly, and I mean, I think that's, you know, that's one of the board's primary responsibilities, right? So I mean, if you haven't set up kind of dashboards for that, then I think that the board is, you know, not doing its job. So I mean, in the case of Reading Partners, what we do is, you know, we use, you know, nationally accepted standards of testing, and we test the kids, you know, beginning of the year, the middle of the year, or the end of the year. And we won't approve any expansion plans until that we know that the quality is at least as good or better, and it's been trending up, before we'll okay any expansion. And that's expansion to a new city or even going deeper within that city. So I mean, the program staff knows that, I mean, they're the final balance check, and if we're not keeping that standard, and that not, you know, that rolls in all the things, so that it rolls in volunteer recruitment. But it's all summed up on a dashboard for the board, and I totally agree. I mean, if you're not keeping the quality, you shouldn't. I mean, charisma will only take you so far, right? The charisma of the founder is only going to take so far. You shouldn't be doing it. Oh, sorry.
Can you talk a little bit about the culture of an organization that's undergoing scale? You talked a little bit about
Sure.
looking at the people and capabilities of the culture.
Yeah, so
Can you repeat the question?
yeah, so I mean, so Lisa's question was, you know, what's the culture of an organization undergoing scale? And you know, it's more stressful, right? Because more things are happening. So I think, you know, and I think the other thing that will always depend on the organization's undergoing is also how much months of reserve capital do you have in the bank. So people always sleep better, you know, when they have 6 months versus 1 month of cash in the bank. So that will also, you know, heighten things. But I think, you know, number one is that, you know, the board, I mean, just going back to the earlier question, I think it's really contingent on the board not to go too fast, right? So, I mean, I think that you really do have to set, you know, what's the dashboard, what are the metrics that you're going to look at on the program side, you know, the human capital side, which is kind of the organizational strength, and on the financial side, right? So, I mean, if you haven't met, you know, you're creating your new reserves, or if you haven't gotten the organizational strength assessments, and these can be things that, you know, you can have people like Taproot do, you know, pro bono, or it can be things that you can actually, you know, bring somebody else in from the outside to pay for. You know, they aren't super expensive, but you can get something that's kind of standardized. Then you shouldn't do that. But I think you, in order to do something like this, I think you have to have, you know, a very engaged board. You have to have a board that basically shows up for every meeting. Okay, all of us, we have a bunch of organizations are represented here, and everybody has kind of some variation of the standard, right? I mean, a typical standard is, you know, each director should attend, you know, 3/4 of the board meeting. I think if you're trying to scale an organization rapidly, I mean, almost everybody has to be at everything, because otherwise you're not in the game. I mean, you just can't be in it. And then I think as organizations grow and you start to get people from different geographies, you also have to question, you know, you might have started as a board that met once a month, but by the time you get to a national organization, you typically only meet 4 times a year. And if you meet more than that, it's not going to work. But I do think there's the culture of really paying attention so that, you know, and it's people really bought into the vision. So you're setting a high bar, you're setting high expectations. Basically, you know, people are all in terms of their time and influence commitment to that.
In either of these cases, did the board actually develop a strategic plan around how you're going to move through this and create a roadmap, or did some of it happen opportunistically, or how did the plan actually go out?
Yeah, I mean, in order to scale rapidly, I think it has to be very disciplined. So, I mean, the format that I like to use when I'm involved anywhere is to just do a 3-year plan, and to basically do that on an annual basis. So you're always refreshing it. So it's what I kind of refer to as an evergreen kind of 3-year plan. I mean, I have trouble with 5 years because I can't see that far. It's too foggy. So for me, it's just like, you know, you approve your, so whenever your fiscal year ends, so a lot of organizations in this room are school-based organizations, so your fiscal year kind of ends when the school year does, plus or minus. So if your fiscal year ends June 30th, school year ends in the beginning of June, you know, you're approving an annual budget in the May-June timeframe, right? So kind of as soon as you've done that, then you're already starting the planning kind of cycle for the next year. And I think the most successful organizations, I mean, everything's on the table, right? I mean, the vision's on the table, the mission's on, I mean, everything's on the table like once a year. I mean, and if you're not willing to put on the table, then I think you may not have evolved to the right culture. But the rolling 3-year plan where everything's kind of on the table and it's iterative, so that at no one meeting are you going to come in and somebody's going to say, today, 2 hours from now, you have to make this decision. That's it. I mean, here's the data, make the decision. Then I don't think you're working far enough ahead. So I think, you know, if you do it, then you've got a couple meetings to get the data, have a framework, have a rough draft, have a final draft, so that all things have been vetted, figure out where your strategic retreat, you know, works in the middle of that, based on, you know, your own style of how you want to run it. But then I think that iterative process is really healthy, and it keeps it open, and you're always asking the same questions, right? I mean, it's good, I think.
Carol Larson of the Packard Foundation often likes to say that one should build in evaluation from the very beginning, and actually best to have an outside evaluator. be watching you all along the way. Have you done that with these two, and how do you feel about outside evaluation?
I think evaluation is very important. I think randomized controlled trials, it's very tough. So I mean, Ellen can give you the full details, but there was a large randomized controlled trial done about 5 years ago. I mean, the problem is when the program model is still evolving, okay, and you lock something in and then you test it for 3 years, and then the program model's improved a lot, you may not get the result out of that you want. So if you look at high-profile nonprofits who haven't completely locked down their model yet, it's not necessarily a good thing. So I think it's a question of where you are in your evolution of your program model. I mean, is it really kind of real final draft that you're really ready to do it? Reading Partners now, as part of the Social Innovation Fund, is doing a very large randomized control trial. So I think they're good. I think they're important to do. I just want to make sure that your program model is really, really nailed.
And do you usually fund those through operating budget, or do you try to get outside funding for evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, the really good ones are expensive. So as part of the SIF grant, Reading Partners got a separate grant, $2.2 million for that trial. Yeah, I mean, so they're very expensive. It was funded by, Ed McConnell Clark, that was the intermediary in that. So they're very expensive, but I mean, at least $1 million to run a good randomized control trial. That's why they're so hard to do. As opposed to getting, university-sponsored ones, so you get a graduate student from the School of Ed to do those things. I mean, that's more typical, which is what they had done up until that. So I think they're really important, but, a lot of them, whether, there's a high-profile one with KIPP in the last 6 months where, the data didn't quite meet the expectations. There have been a lot of them with TFA. So it kind of depends, where are you in your life cycle of your kind of program model. So I'm big fan of independent studies. The randomized control thing, I want you to be ready because it's a lot of money and it may not tell you what you need to know.
And does it take a lot of staff time?
Well, it should take a lot of program staff time in the design, the co-design of it and the oversight of it. Yeah, the answer is yes, but you have to do it. But the hardest thing is that they pay for it when you're ready.
I'm interested in the question of broad versus deep.
Yeah.
Because it's one that we wrestle with all the time. Do you go into 20 school districts and just take 7th graders in math, or do you go into half that number and hit every student? How do you make that? Reading Partners have made that trade-off clearly, and I don't know about New Teacher Center, but how do you think about that problem in terms of growth?
I think it really comes back to the vision, right? And I think so. That's just a great question. And so we've all sat in these board meetings, right, where you've got some people who feel one way and some people who feel another way. And part of that is really that you haven't stepped back and said, okay, let's take it back up to the clouds and let's just talk about, what's the fundamental vision? Okay, is the fundamental vision like, one day all kids in Santa Clara County? I mean, what is the vision? And I think once you get that right, that question should answer itself. So that's what I think. And it could be either way. But I think, my own preference is I think there's too many nonprofits going too wide and not deep enough. So my personal thing is I don't want to get involved unless we're going to at least meet 10% of the community need and have a plan to go deeper. That's my personal preference. So that would be how I would weigh in the vision exercise, but I'm just one vote. But I do think that you should go back, and if it's not clear, you should kind of do that with the board before you go to that decision, because that'll be the driver.
I just realized that I don't really know the difference between wide and deep.
It's just
what
kind
would
of
be some of the parameters that would sort of identify broadness and deepness?
Well, the classic example of, something starts here and then wants to become a national organization. So that would be kind of the horizontal spread, as opposed to, how deep would you go? So there was a really good book called Billions of Drops in Millions of Buckets by Stephen Goldsmith a couple years ago. And he kind of, claimed that the problem was that, there were so many nonprofits, right? It was just kind of spray and pray. We weren't kind of, going after the best and brightest and funding them. So part of that is a lot of nonprofits aren't going, in my opinion, deep enough, and I'm not sure that they're committed to going deep enough. So if you look at, he had a great table in his book. So in that table, it took like Teach for America. In the cities that they were in, they were, serving 1.3% of the community need as they defined it for those type of new teachers and those high-risk urban school districts.
you're making it sound like the parameter is geographic or regional or national. Would it be? So if you were deeper, you might have something good going, and then you just try to really make it dense.
Sure.
Dense application locally.
Yeah.
That would be deeper.
Right.
But if you go hopscotching across the country, that's wider.
Right. And it's always a
Or
balance.
broader.
And it's always a balance.
I see.
Right. It's always a
Okay.
balance. But I think, if you say that you want to be the premier solution for fourth grade literacy, so that's going to be the Reading Partners example, and you're in San Francisco, you're in 10 schools out of 500, it doesn't wash because you're not solving the problem.
Yeah. Well, I think your point is don't try to go to San Jose and do more in San Francisco.
Or commit to the whole Bay Area. You can have a phased roll-in, but I mean, commit to whatever that geography is, right? Whatever that metro geography is, commit to that region at a minimum, depth that you're going to try to go to. I mean, the ultimate depth is going to be determined by a million things you might not have control over, right? Like the quality of your, regional board that fundraises and all these other issues. But I think it goes back to the vision. I mean, what is the vision for how you want to serve the audience you want to serve?
Well, one of the things we've run into, and maybe other nonprofits have as well, is the relationship management with districts is, particularly if you want to get data back and if you want to get cooperation all the way from the superintendent to the teacher level. You've got 4 or 5 or 6 levels in each place you serve, and that's very time consuming to build those relationships.
Right.
So how do you get around that?
Well, it depends on how you do it. So with Reading Partners, because it was at one school, we started selling to principals, and we still sell to principals. Now districts will approach us, right, and say, we want the program district wide. But in that case, we've kept it there for that reason with New Teacher Center, because it's such a human capital investment. It has to be done at the district level. So that means the sales cycles are longer. I mean, it just takes more time. And you do have to navigate the multiple layers. So you just have to adapt the organization to that level of complexity.
Have you been involved with any organizations that have been successful in packaging a program and having somebody else replicate it in order to go broader? Having another organization be able to do that program?
Not directly. Not directly.
You haven't seen that as a model working?
Well, I see it right now. I mean, I consult with Playworks, which is doing it right now in kind of that space where they're doing the training and technical assistance model. Well, I have to say, New Teacher Center does that. So I have seen that because they do training and technical assistance. But I think, once again, the biggest hurdle that you'll see with that is that too many organizations, I think, tried it too early in their life cycle. So have you proved out your model enough that it's really kind of a cookie cutter and you know what all your standards should be? Or maybe it's your model plus a couple other models because it's very expensive and you can't replicate it in all these cases, but you've got what is a really core model that it's obvious best practice and you can hold people to standards. Because, that's what it is, right? You're essentially franchising. You're going to have to hold people to a standard, and if they're not going to meet the standard, you're going to have to, take it away. Let me just go back to the room.
How did NTC know about identifying their leverage for driving in? There's only 4. And so was there like a broad list and it has to be taken down? But how do you go about even identifying what drives impact for what you do?
Well, I would just go back to the vision, right? So, kind of what's the vision? Okay, what's the mission? And then how are you implementing that? And then, so what are the key levers that you see today? Okay, and then, then I kind of draw a wall, okay? And then I would ask the questions, okay, what are the structural barriers from today to the vision of how you need to get there? Right? So, and those are the common levers that you'll see, when you survey all the nonprofits that have reached a certain scale of impact, because they've moved from the pilot phase into some level of direct service, because that's how they prove their model. Okay, and then some of them have moved into some level of kind of that broader adoption, which is whether it's the franchise or the training piece of it, they've tried to offload it, and it may be the training, or it may be something where they've leveraged technology, right, where they've kind of done a hybrid of face-to-face versus online, which is another big paradigm shift that's happening in the nonprofit space, depending on what your program is and how you deliver the program. And then everybody's asking the question of, And it may be that, and most of the organization is from may not want to do that much policy directly, but who would you partner with that is a policy organization? How would you use your data and your seat at the table to influence the dialogue that goes on?
One question sort of off topic, so
Sure.
I'm not offended if you prefer to table it. It seems like in these two nonprofits you've described, the basic strategy is to augment or improve the current school system or model, which is, from my perspective, somewhat broken. Did you personally look at maybe a more direct route to improving student performance, say through the charter movement?
Yeah, I do. I sit on the board of New School Venture Fund, which funds charters. So yeah, I think charters are great. They're just not going to get to all kids, right? There's too many structural limitations to that. So what attracted me about these other organizations is they were targeted interventions that could have a big return, because those were two big levers in the educational continuum, which was just fourth grade leader and teacher performance. But no, I'm a fan of charters. I just, I don't see that 50% of all schools are going to be chartered. I wish we could. Kind of a national hurricane that could get us what Katrina did for New Orleans. But outside of that, I don't see it.
So when you're going from a very high-touch model, when you're evolving into the proclamation, in some of these cases, did you make an explicit decision to fund ahead of the curve to build something that could be scaled like that? Because in that current period of time, the core business budget can't afford any of that. So were you getting external funding for that? How does that work?
Yeah, so what we would do, it's just kind of classic pilots, right? We'd do kind of an alpha, which would be one site, and then if that worked, we'd ramp it up to a beta, which would be 2 to 3 sites. But we'd be just kind of running this in the background at our normal sites, because you're right, we didn't have a lot of money, right? So we would just kind of pilot those things in the background. So whether it was one of those financial model levers, or if it was a curriculum change that could have been a big lever to change impact, we would just start at one site, kind of alpha, then a beta, and just kind of roll it up. But we didn't cover on that yet, but I think that's kind of a really important thing. Is just just kind of creating the culture of innovation, right? So just saying that kind of R&D and running pilots is kind of a core part of organizational DNA if we're going to get to the vision. So yeah, we didn't really set aside a budget in the early days because there wasn't any money. Now it's kind of baked into how we do that, because we know what we're piloting and it's all part of the rolling plan.
The pivot I'm most interested in is from you're scaling direct service,
Yes.
service, then that pivot where you go,
Yeah.
you're going to teach someone else to do
Yeah.
the work. Did you consider that a pilot, or?
Oh yeah, we consider that a pilot too. Oh yeah, and we tried it too early. With Reading Partners, we tried it too early and it didn't work, right? Because we hadn't established a gold standard, we hadn't locked in, what we were doing. Right? It wasn't locked in enough, and then when they didn't perform, we couldn't be there to support them enough, and then it didn't work. So no, absolutely. It's run as a pilot, and it's phased up as a pilot, right? It would be phased up to, for me, I'd want to see it probably working at 5 or 6 sites independently, so I had a good, statistical bell curve in terms of what it looked like.
It seems like one of the ingredients for success in these scaling social programs is combining the expertise and lessons learned from people who've been in the trenches solving social problems and people who've been in the business world scaling products and services. And I'm curious what instances you've seen where any assumptions coming from the business side about scaling have proven to be wrong or needed to be adjusted based on solving a social problem versus a strict business problem. And
Sure.
one of my particular curiosities is around the pace of scaling.
Right. Yes, so we've all been in those meetings, right, where you've kind of got people who, are very accomplished in the for-profit sector, and they kind of come into a nonprofit board meeting, and not all the rules apply, right? So not all the same rules apply, and the timescales don't apply. So I think there can be a acclimatization process for those kinds of people, and I do think that it's important to understand that. So it's good to have a board culture. It's good to ask yourself what that board culture is today and what you want it to be in the future. And then as part of an orientation. Now, the fact that somebody comes in and asks hard questions, I think that's a really cool thing. So that's all great. But I think the biggest problem that a nonprofit can probably get into is stretching too far, right? It doesn't have the financial resources to be able to make it across that particular chasm. So I just think it's being thoughtful, right? So it's both the fiduciary part of it, because you have to wear the three hats, right? So you have to wear the fiduciary hat, you have to wear the kind of the strategic hat, and then you kind of have to wear the generative hat. So I think you can do it with really good board orientation. You can kind of do it with good board history, and then I think you can do it with open dialogue. So I don't think there is any right or wrong to that, but I'm just saying that these are the concerns, these are the process, and it can help you maybe get to a better process. So I mean, if you either have process in place where when a person like that comes on the board, that they can adapt to and work their way through and ask those questions, or you don't, in which case you want to put it in place so it's kind of more systematic. Because I think you do want to float that kind of stuff, because you want people who are going to push the envelope, but it's that fiduciary balance, right? It's just like always, do we do the new hire, before we get the money or after we get the money, right? It's the kind of the classic one, right? And what's all the risk mitigation that's to that? And I think, as you kind of build the boards, I think you can lay all that out, in a budget. I mean, the good budgets I see, have all the risk mitigations, what you're going to do if this doesn't happen, so that people can feel comfortable it's all been thought through ahead of time. And yes, there's risk, but the risk has been mitigated as much as is reasonably possible for the day. Does that answer the question? Or
It
no?
was a very broad question, but yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so we have time for 2 more questions. So,
Ethan?
So outside of this particular area, you've had experience with politically moving into a new jurisdiction where you're basically, if you're competing for local monies or whatever else, or just the focus, you're moving into a new territory and you're not the normal player, you're somebody new. Have you ever looked at that as being a risk factor and how you address it?
Sure, and I think especially early before you develop, a national brand. I think, yeah. In the case of Fly, absolutely. So obviously, if you don't have to have competition locally, that would be great, right? Because you're solving an unmet need. Yeah, yeah. But I think, so I think in the first and the second replication, that becomes, it goes down with time, but it's critically important in the beginning. So don't go there. I mean, just go somewhere else, right? Because there's plenty of unmet need. I just wouldn't go with direct competition when you didn't have to have direct competition.
How do you determine where the need is? Do you wait for them to come to you, or do you go to places where there's low income, low test score kids that, what if they're not receptive to your program?
Yeah, so, I didn't show it here just because I wanted to keep it simple, but, there's a wonderful kind of site assessment grid that we've done that looks at all kinds of, financial criteria, all kinds of, program criteria, population criteria. So, we build a 100-point matrix out of like 20 different data points. Each one is a 1 to 5 scale in terms of trying to determine that need. And then that's a fluid document because you're having meetings, with your top tier candidates as you go through a year to see what that might be. But I think just building out a simple matrix to determine what your criteria are is the way to go.
And making sure that they're open to the program.
Oh, sure. Yeah, but that's like a key one up front. That's like number one, right? How would they be receptive and what's the competition?
okay, everybody, thank you so much for being here, for your great questions, and let's have a round of applause for Lila.